animals, and particularly what happens to wild animals after freezing, after they have been chased or are in danger of being attacked. They freeze, and what happens whenever they realize they're safe, they actually do a lot of shaking, oftentimes deep breathing. Sometimes they jump up and do sort of a skipping, maybe snorting, and go back and join their herd or their community. So what this does is it discharges that trauma energy or that compressed energy, and it completes a natural physiological process. Which again, if you think about in your own culture, what do we typically do in many of our cultures? And that is, we do the opposite of what the animal world does. And we try to shut down that discharge. So if we try to get the person to stop crying, to stop shaking, to calm down. And if they can't do it, or if we can't help them do it, we even give them a pill or we medicate so that they can do that. And Levine says that what we should be doing is exactly the opposite. We should be encouraging people, ourselves and others, to go ahead and tremble and cry and shout and sweat and do whatever our body, as long as we're not hurting ourselves or hurting other people, we should go ahead and discharge that trauma energy. And if we did that, we would end up not suffering probably as much post-traumatic stress disorder as we do. Because from his studies, that was one of the things that he discovered, that wild animals do not typically suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. So we have much that we can learn from the animal world. He would also say if we need to do anything, simply put your hands on the back of a person and tell them to do what they need to do and support them in that way. I think our world would be different if we could just learn this simple concept about trauma. No matter what culture we're coming from. And you can get in some really interesting discussions on culture here on this one. The brain and the body are very closely connected, work very closely together. So when the body has shifted into high gear and is full of this trauma energy, our brains have shifted into low. And this is another, I'm just going to do very simple explanation of the brain, partly because it can be really helpful in understanding what the connection between our body and our brain, and it also helps people realize that they're not crazy because of their responses when they find themselves in a traumatic event. There are basically three parts to the human brain, and we have the instinctual brain, or the brain stem, which is the part that's really in charge of sort of our normal automatic sort of reactions like body temperature, blood circulation, et cetera. But this is a part that releases those hormones and the stress hormones and chemicals for the fight, flight, freeze reaction. And the other part here is the emotional brain, or the limbic system, which is our first alert system. And that's where the amygdala is located here. And whenever we're frightened or there's danger or fear, this part of our brain alerts the instinctual brain, or the brain stem. There's danger, and that the brain stem floods our body with the trauma energy. And the two of them, basically, at that point, these two parts of our brain are in control. And the thinking or rational brain, which is the largest part of the human brain, and the one that we think we use the most, basically is the last to know when we're in the middle of a crisis or a traumatic situation, because we call it the lower brain just because of the way it's situated. The lower brain has taken charge. It's also the rational brain. I just want to mention this here briefly. I think because of our rational brain, even if we were to shake and to let go of all the trauma energy, we still need to, as human beings, we are meaning-making creatures. And so there's a part of us that still needs to make sense out of what's happened in the experience. But for the most part, releasing this trauma energy is a really important part of it. And I think Dr. Daniel Siegel, has a very helpful tool that all of us can do. And I don't know if you can see my hand here or not, but he calls it the brain in the palm of our hand. And he uses this to work with parents, well, to work with anybody basically, and to help them understand what might be happening with them at any given time. And he says this bottom part of your wrist is sort of your spinal cord, and the palm of your hand is the instinctual brain, or the brain stem. And then your thumb coming over becomes the limbic system, or that first alert system. So this makes up our lower brain here. Our thumb and the palm of our hand becomes that lower brain. And then the fingers coming over the top are our rational brain. So what happens when we find ourselves in a situation of threat or fear or crisis, this is the part, the prefrontal cortex is the part that gets disordered, and he calls this flipping our lid. We flip our lid, and this part here is the part that's in control. So part of it is becoming aware of when we're flipping our lid, when we're operating out of our lower brain, rather than operating out of our whole integrated brain, which works a whole lot better than when we're here just in the fight, flight, or freeze stage. So this is one way of one just simple model, and what the point is to be aware of this, and this can help you be aware. And then the second part of this is to have tools or ways that you can release the trauma energy from your body and reconnect the brain, because that will help us be able to respond in a much different way than if we're responding from just our lower brain. The other thing here I'll just mention is that it also is, we can be triggered by memories. And it can be memories, it could be sound, it can be sight, it could be many things that will all of a sudden remind me or take me back to that traumatic event and trigger and put me right back into my lower brain. So again, just being aware of what's happening, that this is why my body is being flooded again with this incredible energy, is very much connected with the brain and with what's being triggered there. Again, what do I need to do to step back and to be able to release some of that energy and to reintegrate the brain will make a big difference on how I respond. So that's just a little bit about the impact of the trauma on the brain. There we go. The last thing here, I want to just talk about the trauma and behavior, because what often happens is that we don't have the tools, and we haven't released this trauma energy, and it ends up getting trapped in our bodies. And this trauma energy that accumulates in there over time, if we haven't used it in a productive way, it's going to come out. As Howard said previously, it's going to come out. We either turn that trauma energy against ourselves, or we turn it against others. We call it acting in behavior or acting out behavior. Some examples of acting in behavior would be basically all of the addictions. Most of the addictions would fall into this category here, whether that's excessive use of drugs, excessive alcohol, cutting, self-mutilation would be another, eating disorders, even things like overworking. The things that we're doing to try to soothe the pain or the hurt that's there, and in the long run, we're actually causing new wounds and new harms to ourselves. Suicide would probably be sort of at the end of the spectrum on the acting in behaviors. Some of the acting out behaviors would include repetitive conflicts, bullying, just the inability to get along with others, maybe just being irritable and grumpy. Just really inflexible and intolerant, and again, on the sort of one end, the extreme end of this spectrum here would be killing someone, murder. So those are acting in and acting out behaviors. Then these are just some visuals of some of those, what they look like. And this is a quote Howard also mentioned. We use it a lot in the STAR training, which comes from Father Richard Rohr, who is a Franciscan priest in New Mexico, says pain that's not transformed is transferred. A simpler way to say that is hurt people, including ourselves and including others. And this can get passed down through the generations, these unaddressed traumas, this pain, the acting in and acting out gets passed from generation to generation. So what we end up doing is we end up literally spinning on what we call cycles of violence, hurting ourselves and hurting others. So in this first, on the right hand, the circle on the right is what is initially is our common trauma reactions. If we get stuck in that cycle, hurting ourselves, it becomes an acting in. It becomes what we call the victim cycle, hurting ourselves. If we act out and we cross over into the cycle that's on the left-hand side, we end up moving from the victim cycle and we become the aggressor. And we have just now caused harm to others, and we've created another victim, more violence, more trauma, and we literally can just keep spinning on these cycles of violence at all different levels. In our families, in the organizations we work in our communities, in our countries, and I would say in our world, this is a helpful model to understand how once victims were hurt can very easily become the aggressors and the ones doing the harming. And so this is just the graphic for these cycles of violence, but I think it's a very important concept, particularly as we look at restorative justice, because restorative justice is very concerned about both working with and both the victim, the ones that have been harmed, as well as the one or the persons who have been harmed. So I think, Howard, if you want to add anything here, feel free to, or we can take some questions at this point for the impact on the body, the brain, and behavior.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. Yes, I think we will, in the next segment, talk more into strategies for addressing this, as I understand it. And some of the questions that are coming in probably fit better into that section. There are some really good questions here, but I'll probably hold them off to later. But here's a couple. Well, there's one question about resources for people interested, and we'll come back to that. But one thing we should have highlighted and didn't in this PowerPoint is the little book of trauma healing, which is in the series that I edit called The Little Books of Justice and Peace Building, and it comes out of the STAR program. It has a lot of the material, although not necessarily these same diagrams. They've evolved over the years. A question that came up is can you give us more of a definition of trauma beyond wound? Can you give us a more complex definition of, or more comprehensive definition of trauma?
Yes. Wound is sort of where we start, and the other part of the definition that we use in STAR is, again, it comes from Peter Levine and trying to distinguish between stress and trauma, and that is the word overwhelmed. So a traumatic event trauma is when we're either overwhelmed physically, spiritually, emotionally, or mentally, and meaning sort of overwhelmed. Let me just say that. And that helps us sort of distinguish between, I think, stress and trauma. We also are adding, let me just say I think we're adding in more and more into the definition that, but it fits with wound, and that is the whole thing of coming from Donna Hicks and her work on dignity. That there are, sometimes people say, well, I just haven't had traumatic events where I've been that really fit into trauma, or I haven't been really overwhelmed. She would say dignity wounds or dignity violations also are hardwired into us, and that the fight, flight, freeze response that I talked about here earlier, it goes into play as well with the dignity wounds. So I'll just stop there.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Another question was, how do we overcome, I'm looking over here at my other screen in case you wonder why I'm looking over here.
Okay.
How do you overcome a person's fear of passing on trauma to loved ones or coworkers through these release activities like crying and yelling? Do we overestimate the detriment of these activities? Does that make sense?
Do we overestimate the death? Yes, I think we're scared to death of them. I think trauma is the elephant in the room for so many, and we're afraid of that, and so we again, it's awareness. So I think the more we're aware of these impacts of trauma on our body, mind, and spirit, and what could be helpful, we normalize that for ourselves and for others. So I think it is a huge educational awareness process that needs to happen. Because yes, it is frightening. People have never heard of this or understand it, but that's part of the work I think that needs to be done.
Yeah, I'm going to read. There's a long question here. As I said, a couple of these will probably be better addressed later, and maybe this one's one too. But here's a question. Recently, when doing a training on peacemaking circles as a restorative justice practice, the question was asked about doing circles in schools. It seems that a couple of pretty violent schools have used community keepers to go into schools to hold circles following some extreme violence and trauma. The concern was that the circles may allow some to reveal personal trauma that they have also been impacted by. What can we do to assure that there is appropriate follow-up afterwards? Can you speak to the possible issue and how we as restorative justice practitioners can make sure that we are aware of that possibility and how to handle it, that is causing no further harm, especially when there are not resources available in some neighborhoods? That is getting ahead a little bit, but is there something you could add at this point about that?
Yeah, I think I will be addressing a little bit of that more in this next segment, but I think an important piece here may be that when you are doing those kind of circles, to have somebody either in the school or the community that would be available to spend some time to refer that person to or to connect that person with, because that is a very real concern.
Yeah, we usually try to make sure we have a trained therapist or interventionist either in the room or available when we do those kind of things. Let's move on then to the next segment if you're ready to do that, and then we'll pull in these questions there.
Okay. So this is the rest of what we call the snail model in STAR. Which is basically you'll see there that we've had a trauma experience and the cycles of violence, but we totally believe that there are tools and there are strategies for addressing trauma and for breaking these cycles of violence that all of us basically can learn and become aware of and hopefully choose some of them that we'll have in our pockets as resources in our toolkit. And I'm not going to go through. You have to come to a STAR training if you really want to know about all the pieces and all the different parts of this, and you get to practice some of these and see real case studies of these. But what I want to point out here is that the one that's right up at the top, under the B of building, which says establishing justice, acknowledging responsibility, exploring restitution, and creative justice. That is the one that encompasses restorative justice for us. And Howard and I have had an ongoing discussion about this model because Howard would say, well, restorative justice is much more than just that point on that snail line. And he's exactly right. I totally agree with him because there's so much overlap between the restorative justice approach and this whole trauma resilience model that we're using in STAR. And so what I want to do right now is sort of show you the overlap that exists there between RJ and restorative justice and this whole trauma healing model. I also just say that I have to say up front that I think restorative justice is probably one of the best approaches that I know of for sort of in general addressing trauma and repairing or restoring broken relationships. Just a couple things, and again, I have no way of knowing how many of you are familiar with restorative justice, but one of the ways to sort of explain restorative justice that I find helpful are the questions that are used. Most of us are familiar with the questions that are used in a lot of our criminal justice systems. They're questions that we often use in schools or we use in homes, and that when something happens, and that is, what laws have been broken, who did it, and what do they deserve? And so the focus is on the offender, the one who did the harm, and the focus is on punishment. Judith Lewis Herman says in her book on trauma recovery, says if you set out to create a system to generate post-traumatic stress, you couldn't do better than a court of law. I think the restorative justice questions themselves, they're very, very different, and it feels to me like they're what I call trauma sensitive, just the questions themselves. And the questions are, who has been hurt, what are their needs, and whose obligations are these to meet these needs? Again, the restorative justice assumptions are also, I think, quite trauma sensitive. The assumptions being when people are hurt, meeting their needs is the first priority. So again, it's dealing with the wound or the pain or the hurt. And the second is that harms create obligations, and that those who are responsible for the harm are obligated to make things as right as they can. And then thirdly, those involved in or who have been impacted by the trauma should be involved in the resolution. So that's usually the ones who've been harmed, the one who did the harming, and oftentimes the community or those closest to these people should be involved. The needs are highlighted. The needs of the victim or the ones who've been harmed are what's highlighted. Just some of these needs of those that are harmed are here on this slide. Safety is often a big one. I had put on here the needs of those harmed, but in many ways it's also the needs of those who did the harming. Again, safety would be one of those. The victims are often afraid. But many times the offender is also afraid of what the response is going to be from the victim. And again, I think this makes sense in light of the cycles of violence that we just looked at. Other needs include information: who, what, how, why did all this happen? And too often in the criminal justice system, the victim, the ones harmed, never get a chance to get this information because they're pretty much left out of the whole process. Truth-telling is a big need. Empowerment, wanting to be involved, to be able to participate. And then another one would be acknowledgement and repair of the harm or vindication. Again, these are really our needs of the victim, but I really think they are oftentimes of the offender as well, and that's partly because of what we know about the trauma reactions that happen to perpetrators. And this comes largely from Rachel McNair, who's done studies on offenders, and basically it's what she calls perpetrator-induced trauma. We call it participatory-induced trauma, but says that offenders oftentimes have the similar trauma reactions as victims and sometimes worse, but those are often not taken into account. And she's talking about people who harm even if the harming is done along the line of duty. So it's not just criminal activity that she's talking about, but also much more broadly than that. Why I think restorative justice, let me back up there. Restorative justice processes usually involve some sort of an encounter of coming together of the one who's been harmed and the one or ones who have done the harming. And this can be in different different ways. Sometimes it's just in the victim offender conference, with a facilitator and with pre-work done. Sometimes it's a bigger family group conferencing process, and sometimes it's circle processes. There's different ways that it can be done, but basically it has to be entirely voluntary for the victim, and the offender, the person that's harmed, needs to accept responsibility for what he or she has done. And so it's this encounter or bringing the groups together, which would fit on the snail model, the reconnection section there, which I'm sorry you can't see right now, but it's that reconnection of when we take that risk to come together and actually meet together. And in those encounters, there are opportunities for everybody involved to ask and answer questions, to express their feelings, to tell their stories, which is an important part of addressing trauma, just to even to see and to meet the other and get a better understanding of the other and what maybe was behind, what were some of the root causes. Oftentimes they're able to work toward a mutually accepted outcome, which may many times includes restitution. I think in that encounter there's often a space created for empathy, and ideally you'd want that to be both ways, and a place to redirect some of our neural pathways. And I think that's the space in there where we see some amazing things happening in restorative justice that just you could never predict what happened before going into that space or into that encounter. This again is for Howard. You would be so right that this includes the encounter that the restorative justice framework or approach sets up includes so much of what's in the reconnection part of our model, and also the acknowledgement part of the model below, which is just key for addressing trauma. Because the whole acknowledgement allows the story to be told. It counteracts the silence, that withdrawal, oftentimes the horror and the shame that's there, that we just continue to carry within ourselves. And so it provides a space to be able to tell the story. And the other thing that really happens as we tell our story, and it doesn't just have to be verbally, it may be through song, it may be through acting, it may be through drama, but as we tell our story, we make meaning, we make sense. It helps us make meaning out of what's happened to us. And again, I think all of us have to do that, and need to do that usually after we've gone through a very traumatic event. Martha Cabrera, she's a Nicaraguan psychologist who wrote a great article, Living and Surviving in a Multiply Wounded Society, which we use in the STAR program. She sort of sums this whole acknowledgement piece up very nicely by saying, when people begin to talk about their story, assume it or accept it and reflect on it, they find meaning and significance in what they've lived through, and this is what allows us to go forward in life. And I think that's what the RJ, Restorative Justice, does in many ways for both the one harmed and the one who's done the harming. Restorative justice and the body. This is where probably I would have most of my questions for restorative justice practitioners would be in this area. I realize that it feels to me like this may be the area that's most missing or that's most needed in the restorative justice practice field, and that is just, it goes along with being trauma-informed, and particularly understanding that whole relationship to the neurophysiology, the brain and the body. Do restorative justice practitioners have the tools they need to help themselves and participants identify, I would say even, that the trauma energy is there, but to release the energy and to help reconnect the brain, or help in this way bring the brain back into a more integrated, functioning manner. And again, I think I have a lot to learn in this area, but it seems to me where I've seen that the most awareness in the restorative justice field here would be with those working with severe violence dialogue, are very aware of the trauma piece. And the other place would be with some of the indigenous groups, where I think built into their ritual, there would be things that would help release that trauma energy. But in general, this would be one of my questions for RJ practitioners. And again, it would be understanding that body-brain connection and then feeling comfortable and confident that they had some sort of physiological or emotional first aid tool that they could use. And that may be something as simple as just doing deep breathing together. It may be EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, which is a tapping technique. Finger holds is one of my favorite, and if we have time here, I will demonstrate or show that one. It's a very simple one that anybody can do. And I think, I would just put down there probably in the etc. just plain trauma awareness as being one of those tools that I think all RJ practitioners should have. And I would also add here, it's not only to be able to use with the victim or the offenders that they're working with who may be triggered during as they tell their story and find themselves back in that fight, flight, freeze state, but also for themselves, for their own self-care. I think it's really, really important that this piece, because they also are being impacted by the stories that they're hearing and by being a part of this encounter or this restorative justice process. And so for their own self-care, I think this is a really key part. I just put in a slide here this comes from the trauma resiliency model. And again, it would be very, very much based on the physiological, neurophysiological responses. And the reason I put it on here is simply even to be aware as you're working in the restorative justice process of some of the different trauma responses over here: constricted breath, rapid heartbeat, tense muscles, pain, numbness, jittery. Some of these things, you could be aware of these in yourself or others. And then some of the common releases are shaking, trembling, burping, yawning, tingling, vibration, chills, tears, laughter. So the key would be to, again, normalize these releases. Rather than being embarrassed or try to stuff them, is to recognize them and not be afraid of them, and then have some tool that you can maybe use to help some of these releases happen. So this is a lot of information in a short time, and there's a lot more that you can read in any of these resources and know, but hopefully this will give you an idea of some of the things I think could really help restorative justice practitioners. And Howard, do I have time to just briefly say something about the finger hold? Am I okay?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Let me just say here, the finger hold is a very simple. This is just one tool. And it's one tool that I've found helpful, and when I return to places throughout the world, people are using it. Partly because you can use it on yourself, and partly because you can use it with others. You can use it with children. You can use it with the elder, with lots of different people. And it comes out of Eastern philosophy and medicine, and basically has to do with energy flow and the meridians. I'm not going to explain all that, but simply to say that the idea is that different emotions are connected with different fingers. And so, for example, for the thumb, if you're feeling extremely sad, it would simply be you hold either thumb. You feel that pulse, you feel the energy, you are cognitively aware and identifying the sadness as an emotion, and then you do deep breathing. And so you're releasing some of that energy and reconnecting. And there's so the index finger is when you're really afraid, the middle finger is anger, rage, ring finger, worry, anxiety, and lack of self-esteem. What I really like about this is because in many cultures, what do children do when they're sad? They suck their thumb. What do we do in this culture and many other places when we're mad? We flip the bird. The next time you want to do that, you grab that middle finger and you hold on and do some deep breathing and see if it makes a difference. It's very simple. It makes me really wonder about the innate wisdom within our bodies when I see some of these sort of typical reactions that we do. That's just simply one tool. For some it works, and for others it doesn't. Or it may not. I'm going to bring us back to the snail, or to the star model of breaking cycles of violence, building resilience. Again, just simply to highlight that I think there is a lot of overlap with restorative justice that includes acknowledgement. It also includes safety. I haven't said, let me just say a little bit here about, I haven't said anything about creative justice, which is mentioned up there. Creative justice is a term that we use when it's not possible for a direct encounter with the person that did the harm. And so oftentimes victims will find some other way that they can, I don't know, it's a type of justice in some ways. So, for example, a person, one case I know, she became involved in became a restorative justice mediator as part of her whole healing process, because there was no way she could ever meet with the person who had harmed her. And that for her has become her creative justice, or her way of working at this issue. For others, it may be like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, where they do an educational kind of process. And I think when the creative justice really is overlapping into many of these other things that are here on our path for addressing trauma and for building resilience. There's a real overlap there. So I guess to sum it all up, I simply would say that I think that restorative justice is one of the best tools I know of for both addressing individual and collective trauma, for breaking these cycles of violence, and for healing and restoring relationships that have been broken, and for changing behavior.
All right. Thank you, Elaine. You're just exactly on time, which leaves us about half an hour for the questions that have been coming in. As those of you who are watching can see, this is a huge issue with lots of implications, and the questions are a variety of questions. I'm going to leave some of the bigger, more complex questions and start with what seem to be the more specific questions. One of them is, I've heard that telling the story of trauma can also be re-traumatizing. How can the need to make meaning and talk be done while at the same time avoiding the danger of re-traumatizing the person?
Great question. Again, I would refer whoever that question is coming from to look at Peter Levine's work. His most latest is In an Unspoken Voice, and the other one would be the slide that I just had up here from Lori Leach from the Trauma Resiliency Group. Basically, what the idea is, that is a concern, but the issue becomes oftentimes of re-traumatizing is when we force folks to push forward, or we force ourselves to continue telling the story, even though we've obviously been re-triggered and the trauma energy there is there again. And the thing is, they say, is to titrate it. You do bits of it and pieces of it that need to be told, but then you work with the somatic part of it. And again, it's too much for me to go into to explain it all here, but both of those resources are very, very helpful on the whole thing of paying particular attention to the somatic, to the physiological responses, and taking the time to release that energy and to come back into much more of a balanced state before having the person continue on with the trauma. So there's yes, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, here's another question, and that is, how do you address trauma in communities where there's a rampant denial of victimization? Huh? That's kind of the opposite end of this thing, but how do you do it with communities that are denying victimization?
Well, I mean, immediately, what that question brings me to Guatemala and to what I've seen in Guatemala, and I think there, after many, many years of silence, there are groups where victims are coming together in communities and starting small at working at addressing trauma at the level that they can. Again, I would say on our model here, there's all different ways of working at this. So even though you can't necessarily do it at the big level or the collective level initially, there are different stages of process that you could do individually or in communities or in small groups that start you on some sort of a journey to addressing trauma and at least get us out of the cycles of violence, of continuing to spin in there.
Well, I think from what you've told me and what I've found is that sometimes the language and understanding of trauma has helped people who won't admit to victimization or are uncomfortable with the language of victimization or the shame of victimization, when they begin to understand trauma and recognize it, that's a safer terrain in which to explore this. And so I think you've seen that in your training sometimes. People who couldn't have come to grips with victimization can grasp onto the trauma and begin to get insight that way.
Right, definitely, yes. Yeah, I think the awareness of it, and I also think the cycles of violence, that understanding of how easy it is to be both victims and aggressor, because we end up being in both of those cycles oftentimes, and becoming aware of that is usually a pretty amazing aha moment for people.
Here's a question that came up early on, and that is, can you speak about the differences and impacts of individual trauma versus whole group trauma or societal trauma? Maybe even historical. I mean, one of our big work you've been doing is in the area of historical harms as well. But can you just talk about the difference between individual and group trauma a bit?
Yeah. I guess what I find is that a lot of these concepts are really important to understand, even whether you're working at just individual or whether you're working at group. Because the whole, for example, the body, the impact on the body, it impacts a whole group of people. And so, again, now this is in the immediacy of a situation, being able to being aware of that and getting whole groups exercises or tools that helps whole groups release some of that energy can make a big difference on how quickly they move through that experience or get stuck in these cycles. On the other hand, oftentimes the big collective, I think oftentimes the collective traumas are the ones that become our historical traumas, and because there's a lot of silence around them, we're often unaware of those. And I think that just is going to take a whole lot more work. But I guess I think that the basic concepts are pretty much play a role in both of them, both the individual and the collective.
Well,
do you want to say more on
that? No, I think that's true. I mean, I think we have found some of our practices in the peacebuilding field generally are able to address those trauma experiences on a more community or more communal level. But there's a question posed very early on that fits right in here, and that is, the person says, I've thought about how this particularly as it relates to Gaza. Can you speak to chronic trauma? I've found very few academic studies on Gaza in particular, where chronic trauma is likely higher than most any other place in the world. So the concept of chronic trauma, can you say anything about that?
Yeah, that's just this week. These weeks, I'm in contact with a doctorate group in Gaza, wanting STAR trainings for women who are victims of domestic violence. And part of it is that they've become very aware they're in a situation of chronic, ongoing, continuous, in some ways, trauma, and they're realizing that this is connected to the larger violence that is happening in their context. And I hope we have the opportunity to do that, to work there. But my own feeling is that again, in situations of chronic and ongoing trauma, and I'm sorry I keep coming back to the body part, but I think if individuals in groups
sources close to the story tell KFI News the reason for sending the letters was because of pressure from the city council for the city manager to take action.
They will move through that
is ongoing to figure out how and why the lights were fired.
And not tend to get so caught up in the revenge mode and in the cycles of violence, but be able to think more, not think more clearly, but the reactions may be different. So it doesn't change the situation, but I think it can be really, really helpful. And I'm not sure that made any sense, but if it's...
Well, I think implicit in what you're saying is that we have found that STAR itself is a kind of intervention. When you do a STAR training in a community, it gives people tools. So you've done that in southern Sudan, you've done it in Haiti, and in Mexico, and a variety of places. And so it's not just a question of training some key community, some practitioners. It's actually a form of intervention itself.
It is a form of intervention, and there's something that happens I think there are a couple things happen. I think bringing people together in a safe space to even be able to talk about this phenomena of trauma and resilience is part of it. There's too few spaces for that to happen. The other thing is that it's that space, but it's also the awareness and the language, and particularly putting it in together with justice and with violence and injustice. It just makes sense to people, and they end up. It's really interesting. For example, in Haiti, people 6 degrees out. I mean, they're training and sharing and sharing and sharing, are saying it changed my life. But I think part of it is just simply the awareness and understanding this phenomena, and that they have other options. I think that's the other thing, is that there are tools and strategies, and so they don't feel so hopeless and helpless that there's nothing that can be done.
Well, just understanding that what they're experiencing is in fact a trauma reaction. They have an explanation for why they're feeling and acting the way they are.
Yes.
Somebody here is asking if it's possible to get information on the group in Gaza dealing with chronic trauma and addressing victimization. Is there any information that's public about this group?
No, not at this point. I don't think I can do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay. One quick question here is whether you had any experience with energy healing practices such as Reiki, and what do you think, if there's potential in this in addressing trauma?
Definitely. We have, during the seminars, we would have someone come, massage, we have someone come with healing touch, the emotional freedom technique. I think they're very, very helpful tools for this work.
So what STAR tries to do is give both understanding and tools, and
That's right.
both on an individual and a community level, which leads us to questions about practitioners themselves and their trauma. When I leave encounters that include this kind of connection and healing, despite my strategies to maintain boundaries and professionalism, I feel personally changed by witnessing, facilitating this dialogue. Is someone studying the effect of this work on the practitioners themselves, not just secondary trauma or compassion fatigue, but the positive effects? Do you know if anything's being done on that? I can't think of anything, but...
I don't know. I don't know of any studies. All I could do is say that for myself, I feel like as I do this work, and part of it is just the model itself challenges me. But as I see people, and again, this happens within a week-long training, use some of these tools and strategies. It's like there's a lot more I feel like I can be doing as well. So, for example, for me while it may not be trauma, this becomes we all have our others, and we all other people. And so it's a stretch for me to keep putting into practice what I'm teaching or what I'm hearing and what I'm learning from other people. I find it to be very, very, very positive and helpful as far as me being a healthier individual. But I don't know of studies, no.
Here's a question. I'm not sure I fully understand it, but it says trauma can be experienced at all levels of conflict. How does one assess that level in a victim or another person within a conflict situation?
Say it again. Say the last part again.
Trauma can be experienced at all levels of conflict. How does one assess that level in a victim or another person within a conflict situation? So or I suppose you could ask, is it important to do that? Or do you just, is it enough to know trauma is going on and work with it?
Well, I think, and work with it is the key.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is that awareness, knowing that there's trauma involved, that there's wounds happening, and then to have some ways of working with it. And again, that's where part of our, I mean, one of the strategies is the whole conflict transformation, and I think that there are a lot of conflict, there are tools there, but having conflict transformation folks be trauma informed and trauma sensitive is really key as well. And I think there's tools and there's ways of making sure that piece is in there. But I would like to see organizations, particularly, be much more, have trauma sensitive components built into their work.
Yeah, I'm just increasingly impressed how important it is for restorative justice practitioners to recognize trauma, to have some tools for dealing with their own trauma that they might be experiencing, as well as for the people they're working with, just realizing how much that dynamic trauma plays through everything.
Yes.
Here's a big question. Can we say that contemporary society is then the culprit of how we deal with stress and trauma? As our civilization modernizes, we move away from our natural physiological ways, the same way that dogs become domesticated under a household. They move away from their natural norms. How do we adapt society? There's a question for you.
Well, I think they're right. I mean, I think it's right. I think it's ironic that we think as we become more civilized and educated that we actually are, in many ways, moving away from what our bodies know what to do. And I also think this is, for me, I think we need to look at some of the more traditional communities, indigenous groups, and I think built into their rituals and into their cultures are practices that allow them to move to work with this whole phenomena in a much different way than what we're able to do it now. And the irony in our society is that we're so drawn to violence and trauma and conflict as far as in attainment, but don't want to deal with it or address it at the real level. So anyway, it's very interesting.
A group in my restorative justice class last week was sort of exploring what would have happened at September 11 if we as a society had recognized that what we were experiencing was trauma and understood the natural responses that in our bodies and our communities to trauma.
Yes. If we would have understood that, and if we would also been aware that we had a whole lot more options and strategies than just revenge and attack back.
Yeah, that's right. We need to get this little snail model and print it on.
You do. I'm telling you. My daughter she took the course, said she basically, you get the snail model in your mind, and she said, I see it every time I talk to a client, every time I go to a movie, and talk to my friends. So it's fascinating, yes. Yeah,
it is. Are you aware of any work that's being done to prevent revenge killings in Syria, post-Assad? Based on your understanding of trauma and restorative justice, what would you say would be the most important early intervention to prevent retaliatory violence in Syria? I'm saving the hard questions to the end here.
Golly.
I mean, part of it is trauma awareness. It's the same thing we've been saying. It's so much matter if you can help people understand that these reactions are natural trauma reactions, and this is where we go, and these are our options. That in itself is an intervention.
Right, and that's why, for me, I feel like the more professions, the more people in the community or in a country that can have this kind of training and be trauma informed are going to be much better prepared in their responses, in their initial responses. And the way they respond in whatever setting they're in, their family, their community, or at a bigger level, if they understand this. So it's not the time to kind of go in and do trauma awareness right now. But it's like, how do we get this trauma awareness, this and resilience awareness embedded in so many of the, whether it's rule of law, whether it's social workers, whether it's restorative justice practitioners or whoever, so that those people are better able to respond in the situation that they find themselves. And there's a lot of work to be done on that area.
There's a lot of work to be done. Yeah.
A lot of work.
But I noticed, and this relates to that earlier question, when you come back from one of these trainings in a really tough communities, you always seem energized. And I know I experienced that too in restorative justice work, and you may be dealing with all kinds of trauma, but you also see this incredible resilience in people, this incredible positiveness. You see, in your case, I've been in those. I've seen the impact of the eyes opening when people begin to realize this in the STAR trainings. And so overall, it's partly what keeps us going, isn't it?
Oh, it's incredible, and it happens. I mean, when you have somebody coming in and saying, for the first time, I didn't have nightmares last night, and it had to do because for the first time she was able to share her story of being raped. Or you have somebody, when we get to the restorative justice part, and the next morning they come in and they say, I called my dad last night, and we haven't talked for 13 years. So you're right. They're just so excited at what they're learning and the movement that's happening just within that week time, that it's very energizing.
After that work we did at the Oklahoma City bombing, some of us were involved with that, and we knew a number of the survivors, and so our program we had a woman in our program from Kenya whose office had been bombed, and she went along, and then we ended up taking survivors from Oklahoma City to Nairobi, and we heard similar stories when people could tell their stories in publicly with people, included people who they knew had been through similar things. We had the same kind of stories, children sleeping alone in their bed the next night for the first time in a year, and just all of that. It just can be so empowering.
Yeah, and those are the immediate stories, and what is really exciting then is when you can follow up with people later on and see what kind of impact it's made. I just have to, the woman that you're sharing about that went with you to the Oklahoma City has now been teaching and doing STAR trainings throughout Somalia, and it's spreading like wildfire. So it's also, I wish there was some way we could follow up with all the people after the training to know the changes that continued to happen in their lives and their communities. But there's still a lot of work to do there too.
There's a question that just came up. There's one big issue that I'll come back to, is structural and state violence. But here's one. I train interpreters in conflict zones, most of whom experience prolonged traumatic stress, and then have to interpret for others who have experienced similar trauma. The interpreter revisits trauma events repeatedly. I usually try and help them share coping strategies with their fellow interpreters, which works very well, but compassion fatigue often takes over. Any thoughts on this?
Well, I would say congratulations that they're aware of compassion fatigue and that they are working at having some strategies for their people, because I think interpreters would be one of those groups of people that are definitely at risk for compassion fatigue. And so part of it is working with them on individual plans of what they can do, and I think organizations have to play a big role in that as well, as far as developing some resources that can be useful. But I think, again, trauma awareness or a process such as STAR that lets interpreters do some of their own work and be more prepared for it is also helpful. It's the same with human rights activists. It's the same with anybody basically who's out there interviewing or getting, working with people that again, to have their own tools for taking care of themselves and being just understanding compassion fatigue and how vulnerable they are to that. I think that's a good start, and I just think if leaders of organizations are aware of that, that's even a more positive thing.
We have about 10 minutes left. We are almost out of questions, although I have a big one here I'm reserving. I notice one person's having trouble hearing the comments. We will have, and people ask about the PowerPoints. I don't think we can make those publicly available. You'll have to answer that Elaine. But we are recording this, and Brian says he forgot to turn it on until just as Elaine started her presentation, but we will have a recorded version of this available. So if you're not able to hear it now, you should be able to listen to it later. Elaine, do you want to say something about the PowerPoints? Those are copyrighted, and we need to keep those connected to the STAR training, don't we?
Yes, that's right. But I would say that anybody who that the three parts of the breaking cycles of violence, the snail model, the trauma experience, the cycles of violence, and then the breaking cycles of violence, those are all available on our website, and people can download them that are interested in seeing the copies of those models. Yes. So
that'd be emu.edu/star.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I believe emu.edu/star, and that they would be under resources.
Okay. And you'll find other resources there too. Okay, here's a nice big question. Can you speak to structural and state violence and how restorative justice, and I'm going to add trauma work, can address that? I hope you have an answer to it, because I've struggled with that and I don't have a...
Well, I think it's a real challenge, but I think it's a really important challenge, and a couple just two things, and I don't know that they're really the answers you're looking for, but the healing historical harms is probably the program here where we try to work the most with that, and again, it's going to take a long time to work, not only at healing them, but then at changing the beliefs and the legacy and the aftermath, all that stuff, the beliefs and the structures. It's just going to take a long time to change them. But I think as a starting point, having this trauma awareness is key to helping that happen, and to figuring out what are the points along the way that we can address trauma, and that we can address some of these wounds, or that we can bring people together to talk about them. It's a start, and again, I think part of it is we want things to happen and change overnight, and these things didn't happen overnight. It took a long time for them to get the way they are now, and it's going to be a process. But I think there's hope if that we can work at it. I'm going to let you answer the restorative justice one, but I think, well, let me just say this comment. Let me give an example. Again, I'm going to Guatemala. I feel like that there's groups there that have started, which would be a place where basically it was apartheid. There's huge structural issues there, and there's multiple wounds. But even for small groups in some communities to be able to start working at the whole acknowledgement piece has been huge. Some, and again, there's many that haven't been able to do this. Some have worked at memorializing at monuments. They get knocked down, but those are steps for healing. Those are steps for addressing trauma. My dream is that someday it'd be possible to have a restorative justice process in these communities where the widows can come together and hear from the civil defense patrols that killed their husbands. They were made to do that. They're hurting and wounded as well. So I think that could be another huge step in the healing process in a place like Guatemala. But they're not there yet. It hasn't happened yet that I know of, but it's certainly needed. And so I would see restorative justice, those kind of processes, just taking us leap years ahead if we could actually get those going in some of the places that where there's a lot of multiple wounds and structural violence and trauma.
This is the fourth of our webinars, and we'll be assessing what we're going to do next semester, and we're thinking of another format that might allow for a little more dialogue among panelists, and maybe this structural issue is one we ought to put on the agenda for a future webinar, because it is such a complex and very important, but very, very puzzling and confusing topic. Do you have any favorite resources on this that you haven't mentioned? People have been asking about that. Do you have anything? There's stuff on the STAR website. There was a little book of trauma healing which came out of STAR. There's the sources you cited. Is there anything else that you would want to note?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned most of them that I would. Donna Hicks on dignity would be the one I would really highlight as well. In fact, it's most of many of the concepts in her book are very similar to what we have here in the STAR curriculum and model. It's just using dignity language and dignity violations rather than the trauma language, but I think it's very helpful and maybe more appropriate to use that language in some cases than the actual trauma language, or might be more accepted.
Okay, is there anything else you want to add before we start winding down here?
I think, Howard, I would just close by maybe wanting to say that I think this is a process that is a journey that's different for every individual and every group. And I would use two quotes to do that. One is a quote that I think well, let me start with the STAR quote first that we use often is one from Antonio Machado, who is a Spanish philosopher, says, travel there is no path, the path is made by walking, and this journey is different for everyone. And so I think part of it is it's not a 10 or 12-step program. It is it's something that it's something that's made by walking. And the other one is a quote by you, which is restorative justice is a compass, not a map. And so I kind of hold both of those together because I think they're both in some ways similar. There are tools and they're there to help guide our journey, but they are the journey. My journey may not be the same as yours, and we should be. That makes a difference in how we approach others or our expectations of others. If we keep those two things in mind.
There is a question here about STAR itself, like how do you get equipped to do this kind of work? So maybe you should, Jen will say something about the next trainings, but there's 2 tiers of training, right?
Yes, we have a STAR level 1 and a STAR level 2, and the STAR 1 basically people come and it's educational experience, but very experiential. So it's not group therapy, but it ends up being very therapeutic and helpful for people. And then, and people leave being able to take things from that and insert it use it in their personal lives and their work. For those then who really say, I really like this model and I think it would be helpful in my work and I want to become a STAR practitioner, we invite them back to do level 2. And that's where then they come back and we review, we go deeper, do some new things, and then they take it and use it in their work or in short presentations or workshops. And then there's another level of certified that we're working on right now, and that's certified trainers, and that's would be a much smaller group of people that would actually be equipped to do sort of the full 4 or 5 day training. Okay,
and there's a question here that about whether we can provide any kind of certification for participation in these webinars, and unfortunately, we can't do that. I mean, this first round is still experimental, but it might be something to take into account in the future. We could maybe do CLEs or other kinds of certification for. Will be something that's a good suggestion we'll be thinking about. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen to say a little bit more yet about what's coming up. And thank you, Elaine, for this.
You're welcome.
Has been great.
Thank you.
And your light in your room varies a lot, but it's pretty good. Yeah. So thank you very much. Okay, Jen, do you want to take over here a little bit?
And can you enable my, oh, thank you. Thank you. Now you're able to show the PowerPoint too? Or Elaine.
There you go, Jen. You're the presenter now, so you should be able to get it to the right slide.
Thank you. So we want to tell you about a few exciting upcoming opportunities. So we'll tell you about a few of the STAR trainings, and then also after that I'll tell you about 2 online courses that are going to be offered in the spring. Upcoming STAR trainings, there are 4 for level 1 that are available at various places around the country, mostly nearby, but there are 2 here at Eastern Mennonite University, one in February, one at the end of May. The one at the end of May will be in the Summer Peace Building Institute. That's important to note. We'll also have June 12th through the 15th. There will be one at the Lancaster EMU campus, and then one at the USIP in Washington, D.C. as well. That's the end of June. There will be a STAR Level 2, which Elaine just mentioned, available the end of April here at EMU in Harrisonburg. You can register and learn more about all of the things that Elaine just shared and find those models by following that link on the PowerPoint there. And then, as I mentioned, there are 2 online courses coming up in restorative justice. The first one will be starting in January, and that'll be led by Carl Stauffer, who's a prof here at EMU. And it's Justice in Transition, Restorative and Indigenous Approaches in Post-War Context. So there's a little blurb I have to tell you more about what that's going to be. In restorative justice, be applied after mass atrocities. This course, Justice in Transition, aims to look at the process of scaling up justice at a collective level in both post-war and structural violence contexts. From rebuilding after a brutal civil war in Sierra Leone to working at transforming historical harms of slavery in the U.S., this online conversation will apply an RJ frame to complex justice processes at the macro level. Gets at some of those last questions that we were addressing. You will interact with practitioners from around the world and learn from leaders in the transitional justice field. So that, again, will start the middle of January. We'll run 5 weeks on Tuesdays from 4 to 6:30. We'll give you an opportunity to interact with all kinds of people.
Okay, I'm going to run out.
And then, with Howard Zehr, starting February 19th, we'll have Recovering the Vision, conversations on restorative justice. Want a more in-depth exploration and critique of the RJ field? Wish you had more colleagues with whom to process the gifts and challenges of this practice? Come explore the critical issues with the grandfather of RJ, Howard Zehr. Learn from leaders across the country and engage with practitioners across the world. So it will be an opportunity to meet weekly with colleagues that are doing similar work to what you are doing in your context, or exploring how to get into this field more fully. That will be February 19th through May 7th on Tuesdays from 4 to 6 Eastern Time. And you can follow the links there to get more information about how to register for those online courses. Finally, a little plug for everything that's happening here at EMU. We have undergraduate programming, including Peace Building and Development major, graduate programs here at CJP and others. We have the Eastern Mennonite Seminary, SBI, and STAR, as we just learned lots and lots. Back to you, Howard.
Out on the page. Okay.
Right. Thank you all for joining us today. We will try to let you know if we have more webinars coming up after the first of the year. If you have suggestions for us, we've been trying to work to make the technical problems as minimal as possible, but we're still on a learning curve. If you have suggestions for topics and things like that, feel free to send them in. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you a good evening wherever you are, and hope to see you again. Thank you so much.